She thought I was just another guest who had gotten lost, looking for the valet parking. That's the part that stays with me even now. The way my daughter looked at me politely, professionally. The way you look at someone you've never seen before in your life, and asked if I needed help finding the reception. She was holding a tray of champagne flutes. Crystal ones. The ones my late wife had picked out at an auction in Charlottesville the year before my granddaughter was born. My daughter was holding my wife's crystal on a silver tray, wearing a black uniform with a white collar, standing on the front porch of the home I had built with my own hands over 37 years, and she did not know who I was. I had driven 4 hours from the rehabilitation facility in Roanoke that morning. I hadn't told anyone I was coming. I hadn't told anyone much of anything in the past several months, because I had learned slowly, painfully, the way you learn things when you've had too much time lying in a bed staring at a ceiling, that the moment you tell someone what you know, you lose the only advantage you have. My name is Robert. I'm 64 years old. I built Hargrove Ridge from 47 acres of overgrown Shenandoah Valley farmland, and a promise I made to my wife on our wedding night that I would give her something lasting. Something that would outlive us. By the time I turned 50, the property had grown to 212 acres, including a working vineyard, a restored 1890s farmhouse, 3 guest cottages, and a main residence that an appraiser had valued, 8 months before my stroke, at just over $29 million. 8 years ago, I collapsed in the cellar during harvest. An arteriovenous malformation, a tangle of blood vessels in my brain that no one had known was there, ruptured without warning. My brother found me 2 hours later. I was airlifted to UVA Medical Center and spent the next 11 days in a medically induced coma. When I came out of it, I couldn't speak clearly. I couldn't walk without help. My right hand shook so badly I couldn't hold a pen, which mattered more than anyone realized at the time, because of what my brother asked me to sign during those first confused weeks in the step-down unit. He told me it was temporary. He sat beside my hospital bed with his wife standing just behind his left shoulder, the way she always stood. Slightly behind him, slightly above everything, and he told me the power of attorney was just to keep the estate running while I recovered. He said my daughter was too young, she was 16, to manage things. He said he would take care of everything. He looked at me with the face I had known my entire life. My brother's face. And I believed him, because when you are 60 years old and your brain has just tried to kill you and you cannot remember what day it is, you believe the people you have loved the longest. My wife had died 3 years before my stroke. Ovarian cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the morning, I held her hand in our bedroom and watched her go. After she died, I threw myself into the estate. My daughter was 13, furious at the world the way grieving teenagers are. And we found our way back to each other slowly. Through the vineyard work, through the long evenings on the porch, watching the sun go down behind the Blue Ridge. She had her mother's hands. The same way of moving through a room that made you feel like the room had been waiting for her. My brother had always been cordial about the estate. That's the word I would have used. Cordial. He came for holidays. He and his wife admired the renovations. He asked reasonable questions about the wine production. His wife made comments about the guest cottages that I had chosen to interpret as compliments. I never registered the difference between cordial and covetous until it was too late, and by then I was in a facility in Roanoke with a diagnosis of significant cognitive impairment following acquired brain injury, and a legal guardian, who was my brother. I was there for 6 years before anything shifted. The shift came from a physical therapist named Marcus, who started working with me in my 4th year at the facility, and who was, unlike most of the people I encountered during those years, constitutionally incapable of talking down to a person. He treated me like my mind was intact even when my words came out tangled. He noticed things. He noticed that on days when I was frustrated, my cognition actually sharpened rather than deteriorated. He noticed that I could follow complex chess problems on the board he brought on Tuesday afternoons. He noticed that my shaking hand was steadier when I was angry than when I was calm, which he found medically interesting and which I found privately useful. He was the first person to say out loud what I had been circling for years. He said, "Robert, you are not what they say you are. It took another 18 months after that to find the attorney. Marcus helped. He was careful about it. Careful the way you have to be when someone's legal guardian controls their communications and their finances and their access to the outside world. The attorney's name was Catherine, and she specialized in elder financial abuse. And when I finally sat across from her in a conference room at a law firm in Charlottesville the first time I had been in a real building in 6 years, she listened to me talk for 2 hours without writing anything down, just listening. And then she said, "Let's start with the property records." What she found took 8 months to document fully. My brother had used the power of attorney to refinance Hargrove Ridge twice, pulling out nearly $4 million in equity. He had transferred the 3 guest cottages into an LLC, registered in his wife's maiden name. He had reclassified the vineyard operation as a separate business entity and installed himself as sole managing partner. He had, at some point in year 3 of my time at the facility, told my daughter that I had passed away in the night from a secondary hemorrhage. She was 19 years old when he told her that. He told her the estate had to be sold to cover debts. He did not sell it. He moved into the main house with his wife and told my daughter she could stay on as household staff. She had stayed. For 5 years, my daughter had stayed in her own home, in a staff bedroom off the kitchen, because she was 23 years old with no college education. My brother had declined to use any estate funds for her education. No savings, no one to call, and nowhere else to go. She had stayed because it was her mother's house and her father's vineyard, and she understood on some wordless level that leaving meant losing the last physical thing that connected her to us. I did not know any of this the morning I drove up the mountain. I knew the legal situation. I knew about the refinancing and the LLCs and the fraudulent guardianship documentation. Catherine had spent 8 months building a case with a forensic accountant and a retired FBI financial crimes investigator she worked with regularly. I knew that the Virginia Attorney General's office had been briefed. I knew that 2 federal warrants were being finalized. I knew that my brother had scheduled a charity gala at Hargrove Ridge for that Saturday evening. 140 guests, a catered event, a string quartet on the lawn, the whole performance of a man who had built something and was graciously sharing it with his community. What I did not know was that my daughter would be working the front door. She was wearing her hair up, the way her mother used to wear hers in summer. She had her mother's eyes. She looked at me the way you look at a stranger kind, slightly cautious, professionally warm, and she said, "Good evening, sir. Are you here for the Hargrove Foundation reception?" The Hargrove Foundation. He had named his charity after my estate. I said, "I'm not here for the reception." Something moved across her face. Not recognition, not yet. Something more like the feeling you get when a word is on the tip of your tongue. A tremor of almost knowing. She said, "Can I help you with something?" I said, "I built this porch." She went very still. I said, "The second board from the left has a knot in it that I filled with epoxy in the summer of 2003. And every year in August it works a little loose. I imagine you've been stepping around it." She set the tray down on the porch railing. Her hands were shaking. She looked at my face the way you look at a photograph that doesn't match the memory you have of it, the same subject. Different time, different weight, different lines. She said very quietly, "You're supposed to be dead." I said, "I know. I'm not." What happened in the next 3 minutes I will not describe in any detail because it belongs only to her and to me. I will say that my daughter's arms around me felt like being allowed back into something I had been locked out of for a very long time. I will say that she cried with her whole body, the way she had cried at her mother's funeral, that same total surrender to grief and relief at once. I will say that I held on. When she could speak, she said, "How long have you known?" I said, "About the estate? 8 months? About you?" "I just found out." The sound she made then was something between a laugh and something much harder to name. I had not come to the gala to confront my brother in front of 140 charity donors. I want to be clear about that. I am 64 years old, and I have made enough impulsive decisions in my life to know that the satisfying dramatic moment almost never produces the lasting result. What produces lasting results is documentation, patience, and the correct sequence of phone calls. Catherine was in a car at the bottom of the driveway with two attorneys from the AG's office and the forensic accountant. The FBI financial crimes agent was coordinating with local law enforcement. The timing had been planned around the gala because my brother would be on the property. Documented witnesses would be present, and the catered event would have generated a clean paper trail of expenditures drawn from fraudulently obtained estate funds. That last part, Catherine had explained to me, was the kind of detail that makes judges deeply unsympathetic to defendants. I called Catherine from the porch and said 3 words. "We're coming down." My daughter and I walked down the driveway together. She had taken off her serving uniform jacket somewhere in those 3 minutes on the porch, and she walked beside me in her white shirt with her arms crossed against the October chill, and I don't think either of us spoke for the first 100 yards. She said, "He told me you had a second bleed. He said you died on a Tuesday." I said, "I didn't." She said, I should have done something. I should have gone to the hospital myself. Gotten records." I said, "You were 19. He was your guardian. He controlled the money and the information." I paused. "This is not something you should have been able to fight alone." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "His wife put me in the staff bedroom." I said, "I know." She said, "She calls it the cottage apartment." I said, "Of course she does." The October grass along the driveway was silver in the early evening light. The vineyard was to our left, the rows running straight up the hillside the way I had laid them out 22 years ago. And even in the low light, I could see they were well tended. Whatever else my brother had done, whoever he had hired, they had kept the vines. I was glad for that in a way I hadn't expected to be. My brother came out of the front door at the sound of the vehicles coming up the driveway. He had dressed well for the event. He had always dressed well, which I had once taken as a sign of self-respect and had since revised my interpretation of. He stood on the porch with a glass of wine, my wine, from my vineyard. And he watched the cars, and then he watched me, and I watched his face understand what was happening. It started at his eyes, the recognition, then the calculation, then something that I had once known as my brother's face, folding into something I didn't have a name for. He said my name, just my name, like a question. I didn't stop walking. Catherine did the talking that needed to be done. That's what she was there for. I had learned over 8 months of working with her that she had a particular quality of stillness when she was doing her most serious work. She became quieter the more consequential the situation, which I found deeply reassuring in a lawyer. She handed my brother a document and she explained what it was. And while she did, the 2 attorneys from the AG's office stood to her left, and the financial crimes agent stood to her right, and my brother's wife came out onto the porch behind him and stopped dead when she saw the gathering on the lawn. I stood to the side, my daughter beside me, and I watched. I am not going to describe it as satisfying. That's not quite the right word. The thing I felt watching my brother's face as he read that document was not satisfaction. It was closer to the feeling you get when a door that has been stuck for years finally opens, not joy exactly, but the simple physical relief of resistance giving way. 8 years of being told you are less than you are. 8 years of being managed and medicated, and gently, professionally, institutionally diminished. 8 years of my daughter sleeping in a staff bedroom in her mother's house. The feeling when that door opens is not joy. It is closer to stillness. My brother was arrested, along with his wife, that evening. The guest list for the gala was provided to investigators as potential witnesses to statements my brother had made about the estate's ownership. His LLCs were frozen. The refinanced mortgages were flagged for fraud review. The process of unwinding 8 years of financial manipulation does not happen in an evening. Catherine had been very clear with me about that, but the legal mechanism had been set into motion properly and irreversibly. And that was enough for that night. The gala guests were politely redirected. The string quartet packed up their instruments in the dark. The catered food was, my daughter informed me with a dry precision that reminded me forcibly of her mother, already paid for. So she went back to the kitchen and made sure nothing went to waste. I sat on the porch for a long time that night, after everything had quieted. The night was clear and cold, and the Blue Ridge was a dark shape against a darker sky, the same view I had looked at for 37 years, the view I had looked at the night my wife told me she was pregnant with our daughter, the view I had looked at the night my wife died, the view I had looked at every single morning during harvest for 2 decades. I had been away from it for 8 years, and it looked exactly the same. The mountains do not register 8 years. The mountains do not register anything less than geological. My daughter came out and sat beside me. She had found one of my old barn jackets in the mudroom. It was still there, still on the same hook, which told me something about the person my brother's wife presented herself as versus the person who leaves an old man's jacket on a hook for 8 years because touching it feels like an acknowledgement. She pulled it around her shoulders and tucked her feet up on the chair the way she had since she was 12. She said, "The guest cottage that. Aunt, that her cottage. The one in my name." I said, "Catherine is handling that. It'll take some months." She said, "I just want my room back." I said, "Which one?" She looked at me. I said, "The blue room or the one with the window seat?" She said, "The window seat one." "Obviously." I said, "Then that's yours." We sat for a while without talking. The vineyard was dark below us. Somewhere down the hill an owl was working. That low repeated question in the dark. She said, "I have to ask you something." I said, "All right." She said, "Did you know about me? About what was happening here? Before the 8 months?" I thought about that. I thought about how to answer it honestly. I said, "No. I knew something was wrong with my situation. I didn't know the whole shape of it until Catherine started pulling records. I didn't know you were here. I didn't know what he had told you." I paused. "I want to be honest with you. There were years in the facility where I didn't know much of anything. The medication they had me on, some of it was appropriate for what I was, which was a man recovering from a serious brain injury. Some of it was not appropriate for what I had become, which was a man who was recovering." She was quiet. I said, "Marcus, my physical therapist. He figured it out before I did. He kept saying that my cognition was better than my chart said it was. For a long time, I didn't believe him. When you're told long enough that you're diminished, you start to see yourself that way." She said, "That's what he was counting on." I said, "Yes." She said, "It worked for a long time." I said, "It did." The owl asked its question again from somewhere in the dark below. She said, "What happens now?" I said, "The legal process takes a while. Catherine says between the AG case and the civil recovery action, we're looking at 1 to 2 years before everything is fully resolved. We'll be back in the house legally. Within the month, the temporary order was part of what was filed today. The financial recovery will be slower." She said, "That's not what I meant." I looked at her. My daughter, 24 years old, in my old barn jacket, in the chair where she had sat since she was 12, on the porch of the house her mother had chosen the porch boards for. I said, "What did you mean?" She said, "I mean, what do we do now? You and me." The simple directness of it. Her mother had had the same quality, the ability to cut straight to the thing that actually mattered without ceremony, without preamble, as though life were too short and too serious for indirect approaches, which, as it had turned out, it was. I said, "We run the estate. Together, if you want. Catherine's firm has a management consultant who specializes in exactly this kind of recovery situation. The vineyard is in better shape than I expected, honestly. The infrastructure held." I paused. "I'd like to teach you the cellar work. I'd like you to know it the way I know it. The whole operation." She said, "I know more than you think. I've been watching them run it for 5 years." There was something in her voice when she said that, not bitterness exactly. Competence. The particular confidence of someone who has been forced to learn a thing by necessity and discovered they were good at it. I said, "Then you're already ahead." She almost smiled. "Not quite." She said, "He told me you were proud of him. When he was doing the charity work, He used to say he had this thing, he said, that you had told him before you died that you wanted the estate to be used for good. She paused. He said it a lot. At dinner parties. In interviews. I said, I never said anything like that. She said, I know. I knew. But I was 19 and living in the staff cottage, and I didn't have money or a lawyer or... She stopped. Restarted. I want you to know I thought about leaving. I thought about it a lot. I stayed because I couldn't make myself leave Mom's house. I know it probably kept me in a bad situation longer than... I said, it brought you here. On this porch. Tonight. I said, I'm not sure leaving would have been better. She was quiet for a moment. She said, Catherine seems very good. I said, she's exceptional. She said, how did you afford her? If he had the estate, I said, Marcus lent me the retainer. I'm going to pay him back with interest, and also with a case of the 2019 Cabernet Franc, which he has been told is exceptional, though he has not yet had the chance to verify this personally. She laughed. First time I had heard her laugh. It was her mother's laugh, sudden, unguarded. Slightly louder than she probably intended. The kind of laugh that makes other people smile without knowing why. I had not heard that laugh in 11 years. I looked out at the vineyard. The dark rose running up the hillside. 37 years of this view. I have thought a great deal, in the years since, about what my brother believed he was doing. I don't think he woke up one morning and decided to become the kind of man he became. I think he told himself a story the way people do about what was owed to him, about what he deserved, about how the world had arranged itself unfairly, about how my success and his comparative ordinariness represented some imbalance that the universe ought to correct. I think he told himself that story for long enough and in enough detail that it became, for him, the truth. I think his wife helped him tell it. I think the story got away from them, the way stories do when they stop being stories and start being the justification for actual choices, actual harm to actual people. I don't tell you this because I forgave him. I didn't, and I don't plan to. I tell you this because it matters to understand that the people who do this to their families are not usually monsters in the way we like to imagine monsters: obvious, identifiable, visibly corrupt. They are usually people who are very good at being ordinary in public, and very good at telling themselves stories in private. And the gap between those two things is where the damage lives. What protects against it is not being smarter than they are. What protects against it is documentation. It is finding one person, one Marcus, one Catherine who looks at you and decides to tell the truth about what they see. It is refusing. Even when you are exhausted and medicated and told daily that your own perceptions are unreliable, to fully surrender the knowledge of what you built and what it was worth and who it was built for. I had built Hargrove Ridge for my wife and my daughter. I had built it to last. The fact that it was still standing, the vineyard still producing, the porch board still solid under my feet, felt less like a victory over my brother, and more like proof that some things hold because of what they were made of, not because of who was claiming them at any given moment. The mountains don't register 8 years. Some things are built the same way. My daughter fell asleep in the chair eventually, still in the barn jacket, the way she used to fall asleep on the porch when she was small, quickly, completely, without any apparent transition. One moment present, and the next entirely somewhere else. I covered her with the blanket from inside the door, and sat with her for a while longer in the quiet. The estate was quiet. The gala was gone. The catering trucks had left. The guests had gone wherever guests go when the party turns out to be something other than what it was advertised as. My brother was somewhere in the custody of people whose job it was to deal with him now, and his wife was with him, and whatever happened to them in the coming months and years would happen according to processes larger and more patient than anything I could have arranged. Below me, in the dark, the vineyard waited for morning. I am 64 years old. I lost 8 years to a room in a facility and a story my brother told about who I was. I don't have a philosophy about that, exactly. I don't have a lesson I've extracted and polished into something quotable. What I have is a daughter who laughed tonight for the first time since I can remember, and a porch I built with my own hands, and a vineyard that held through everything, and the specific, unremarkable, enormous fact that I am here and the morning is coming. A man's life is not measured by what gets taken from him. Any life long enough will have things taken from it. A man's life is measured by what he comes back to when the taking is done. Who is still there? What is still standing? What you can rebuild? And what turns out, against all reasonable expectation, to have never needed rebuilding at all. The owl went quiet sometime before dawn. The blue ridge began to gray in the east. I watched the light come back to the vineyard.